Minna, is it right that you've also spoken at the UN?
Yeah, UN Women.
Great. Thank you. Fab. Okay, I think we'll make a start. Hello everybody and welcome to this evening event if you're joining in the UK, but I'm aware there's people all around the world joining this evening. Is their time for self-care in a climate emergency. I'm delighted to have with us each of our panellists tonight, Maddy, Minna and Tim, and I will introduce each of them formally shortly. And I'm Musker-Sherwood. I'll be your chair and host for the evening. I've never run a webinar before, so we'll see how this goes. I'm pretty sure that those of you that joined bang on the dot will have heard me yakking away already. So good start from me there. I am really interested in this question, is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? Because if you've been following my work for a while, you'll be aware that I was running a climate communications charity for 6 years. It was fast growing. I loved it until I didn't love it anymore. And I essentially burnt out. And it was pretty spectacular. I was unwell for quite a long time. And really, it's brought me back to this question again and again of, when it feels like, as Greta says, our house is on fire, can we take this time out for ourselves? And what does that look like when we're living through a climate emergency? So I'm really happy to have each of these panelists, because whether they're aware of it or not, they've had quite a significant impact on my own journey with burnout. So I'll try not to get too starstruck this evening. So a bit of housekeeping. You might be wondering why you can't see each other as sort of on videos, which is usually how events are run. We had over 250 people sign up to this event. So there are a lot of you joining tonight, which is great. We chose to run it as a webinar event for a couple of reasons. Firstly, having everyone's cameras actually uses up a lot of carbon. And secondly, it being a webinar, it gives us this function to, as well as having the chat, which I can see you're all using now, which is great. Thank you for that. We also have, you'll see a little question and answer option at the bottom. So if you've got a question for the panelists, and we've left a good chunk of this evening for those questions for the panelists, then stick that in the question and answer box. And it means if you see a question that someone's put in there that you like, you can give the little thumbs up by that question and click, and it votes for that question. That pushes it to the top. And so the most popular questions, the ones that we most want answered, will be at the top, and those are the ones that I'll ask the panelists. I've got a few pre-prepared questions for the panelists, which we'll jump in with first, and then we should have at least 45 minutes for questions that are coming up from the event tonight. And I've got a few pre-submitted questions that I'll drop in here and there when it's appropriate to as well. Before jumping into any of that though, and introducing each of our panelists, I'd like to take this opportunity to do a poll for you to get a sense of the room and who's here and where we're all coming from with this. So let's see, I'm going to do a poll. Right, here we go. Sorry, I'm just getting a question. I need to make this person host. Here we go, my first webinar. It's all happening now. So I might have to leave the poll. I can make Emma host. Sorry, sorry about this, everyone. I might have to leave the poll. If we can figure that out by the end, then I will ask. It would be so good to get, there we go. It would be so good to get everyone's opinions on, is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? Right, figure that out. So we're going to do a poll. Sorry about that. I want to ask everyone who's here, is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? It'd be really simple. There'll be a yes function and a no answer. So choose your one. We're going to do the same at the end and see how opinions are shifting. So take a vote. Click on the answer that works for you. Is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? Yes or no? Fab. Great. Emma, how are we doing for answers? Okay, so 83% of you here tonight think there is time for self-care in a climate emergency. 17% of you say no. So I'm going to make a note of that. See how things are at the end. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so our first panelist that I'm going to introduce is Maddy Carroll of the European Climate Foundation. Maddy, thanks so much for being here. What I'm going to do is introduce each of our panelists separately, and then ask them to respond to the question about what their self-care practices are that have sustained them through their leadership roles, and then after that we'll come to the main question of the night. So I've got Maddy's bio here. Maddy started off her career in consumer PR, inspired by Eddie, the Jennifer Saunders character in Absolutely Fabulous. Maddy was working at a PR agency. She discovered a passion for the environment working for a client who sold fair trade and eco goods, which triggered an awakening. Maddy quit that agency life and went to work for a wind energy company. Naive of politics, Maddy thought the process went, there is a problem, carbon, there is a solution, renewables. So Maddy spent 4 years in village halls up and down the country doing public consultations for wind farms, but soon realised things were not that simple, that the climate crisis is all about politics and the public, so Maddy decided to go into campaigning. Maddy worked largely for small insurgent organisations driven by people power model, such as 1010 and 38 Degrees, and now works for the European Climate Foundation. So the European Climate Foundation, for those that don't know, was founded in 2008 by philanthropists to develop solutions and activate political engagement and public consciousness. It's a hugely influential organisation in terms of climate action across Europe. So, Maddy, by way of introduction, I wonder if you could share with us, what are your self-care practices that have sustained you through what I can begin to kind of identify with those many years of political engagement to where you are now?
Thanks, Jo, and just to say thanks for having me here. It's an issue really close to my heart. I mean, the climate crisis is basically it's a grim reality with far-reaching emotional impact. And working on climate in whatever way, in professional or in activism, professional life or in activism, it means basically looking into the eye of that storm day in, day out, while those around you largely get on with normal life. And it can be frightening and alienating and at times lonely. So, during my career, I've sort of developed a number of practices to sustain myself. And I thought of sort of three to touch on at the beginning here. And the first one's quite simple. It's basically about learning about yourself and knowing what gives you energy and what drains you of energy, and making sure you kind of have a balance of those things in your life, because you can't always avoid things that drain your energy, but you can make sure you build in activities that top that up. So be that exercise, time in nature, a long sleep, a bottle of wine with a mate and a rant. It's just key to know what you need and be generous with yourself at the right time. And then secondly is less about kind of self-care and more about movement care, and playing a kind of active role in creating the culture of the spaces that you're in. I always try to model behavior that I think is healthy. So asking questions, showing vulnerability, being humble, and supporting others and asking for help at the same time. Because climate spaces can be quite technocratic, they can be macho, they can be competitive, they can be intimidating. And all of that is real nonsense. But that culture is created by everybody in that space. And if you feel rubbish in a space, then other people will too. So developing a braveness to actively try and shift that has been something that I've found really, really helpful. And then the final thing I do is to try and keep faith in the goodness of human nature. And I guess that's a lofty sounding one, but what that looks like in practice for me is always seeking out positive stories, and not often on climate, actually. So during the last 18 months being stuck on the sofa, the places I've found this faith in nature, in human nature, is through some reality TV shows like Gogglebox and Great Pottery Throwdown and Glow Up and Sewing Bee, and these things where people are trying, learning, discovering, supporting each other, and it's proved a real kind of salve for the soul over the last 18 months. So yeah, those are my three things: managing energy levels, contributing to a healthy culture, and cultivating hope in humans.
Amazing, thank you. I was just furiously writing notes. I didn't have we went really practical straight away. That's great. Thanks, Maddy. Okay, so on to Minna next. Our next panelist, I'll read out Minna's bio. Minna Salami is a Nigerian, Finnish and Swedish writer and the founder of the multiple award-winning blog Miss Afropolitan, which connects feminism with critical reflections on contemporary culture from an Africa-centered perspective. As a lecturer and keynote speaker, Minna has spoken at over 200 universities, cultural events and conferences on 5 continents, including at the United Nations. Minna is the author of Sensuous Knowledge, a Black feminist approach for everyone, a collection of thought-provoking essays that explore questions central to how we see ourselves, our history, and our world. And it was that book that led me to really change my perspective on how I was approaching self-care. So I'm so delighted to have you here, Minna. Thank you. Could you share with us some ideas for how you have sustained yourself through the leadership role that you are holding in the world right now?
Thank you, Jo, and thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to this conversation, which in itself feels quite nourishing, and it made me reflect on self-care and what that means, and that in itself is a bit of a practice of self-care. So insofar that I consider myself a leader, I guess that word can mean so many different things, but I'll embrace it. It's what self-care practice looks like to me is first and foremost to kind of bring myself back into focus, and to, yeah, as Maddy said as well, to develop self-knowledge in a sense, because so much of communicating with others, particularly in spaces in which there can be a lot of antagonism and spaces of struggle, which, the feminist movement where I'm primarily active is, as is, climate justice and racial justice and all of those other spaces, just making sure that I can show up in those spaces in a genuine, authentic, and valuable way. What I primarily need to do is to gain self-knowledge and focus, and to sort of embody the values that I then want to share with others and encourage others to embody. And the way that I do that is by making time in a busy schedule to do the things that I enjoy and that I find valuable for self-knowledge. So reading, spending time outdoors in nature, but also really just being still and making time to observe, if you like, to observe myself and others, and kind of social structures around me, the non-human natural world. And also a big part of that is engaging with the arts. So art, be it poetry, fine art, music, dance, just that kind of creative and imaginative world is really central to my taking out time for self-care.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, great. Yes. So I really want to come back to this thing of a busy schedule. We had a pre-submitted question about that, but I'll introduce Tim first to our conversation that's ongoing. Tim, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to read out Tim's bio. So Tim Loughton, MP, Member of Parliament, is a British Conservative MP. Prior to Parliament, Tim worked in the private sector as a fund manager in the City of London before becoming a director at Fleming Private Asset Management. Tim was first elected to Parliament in 1997, and ever since, Tim has held various positions during his time in Parliament, including Shadow Minister for Environment from 2000 and Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Children and Families following the 2010 general election. Tim chairs a number of all-party parliamentary groups, that's APPGs, covering a wide range of issues such as Tibet, archaeology, the British Museum, Armenia and Yemen, as well as co-chairing the APPG for mindfulness. In 2019, Tim successfully piloted one of the most comprehensive private members' bills through Parliament, which instituted civil partnerships for opposite-sex couples, gives powers to coroners to investigate stillbirths, and enables mothers to enter their name on marriage certificates for the first time. Tim has also recently joined the Conservatives Against Racism for Equality as an advisory board member. Tim, thank you so much for being here. What has sustained you through all those many different roles that you've had in public life?
Well, thanks. I think the first thing is not list of boring biographies like mine, but there we go. And I'm a bit of a fraud, I think, on this panel. You are. I'm surrounded by experts on climate change and other things. I'm just a simple jobbing politician trained as a Mesopotamian archaeologist. But hey, the advice, one of my big things in Parliament, I set up back in 2008 something called the I Project, Eco Young and Age, where we are training young pupils and students to be the eco warriors of the future in my constituency, in our local schools, and lots of stuff I'm doing in Parliament. So what sustains me? Not watching football, that's for sure, which has been the most stressful thing for anybody supporting England, and probably not getting completely involved in politics, which is a really rough business. So 3 things that sustain me: baths, compost, and empathy, in that order. So I think I've been asked to be part of this because I chair the All-Party Group for Mindfulness, and we've been doing mindfulness in Parliament since 2013, and something like 250 MPs and Lords have gone through mindfulness classes, which has been absolutely fascinating, and it's had a real impact, I think, on the way we engage with each other. But I do my mindfulness at Bath, and the great thing about mindfulness is you can do it literally anytime, any place, anywhere. And I was hosting a seminar involving politicians from around the world who do mindfulness, and we had the great guru of mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn, had given a speech, and I was asked to give the vote of thanks. And I point out that I do my mindfulness in the bath. I can spend up to an hour in the bath every morning, and I do some work in the bath as well, but I reserve a little bit of time just to empty my mind and to regulate my thoughts, step into the present, and sort of work out my day and order myself. And that is my daily, every morning early. That's how I regulate myself to cope with the challenges in the day ahead. And I've done it for years and years and years. Even before I became a member of the mindfulness group, I was doing that sort of thing. And that I find hugely therapeutic and keeps you grounded. I then hit the front page of the Times, and MP spends an hour in the bath every morning. So, hey, you can't win, but at least it got some great publicity for mindfulness and how we cope with low-level mental health problems. Second is compost. So every day I get 350 emails. So I'm dealing with emails, people complaining about they can't get operations in hospitals at the moment, people complaining about the refugee situation in Yemen, people complaining about whatever it may be. I can't deal with all of that. I can't solve all those things. What I can do is go out to my vegetable patch, spread some compost, and focus on the problem of the moment, which I had yesterday, is the black flies eating my broad bean plants. And that completely divorces me from all these other challenges and problems in my day-to-day life of being a politician. And I eliminated my black fly, I spread my compost, and I came back with the emails, and I think better state than I started. And thirdly is empathy. One of the things about lockdown is my children came home, which actually was quite a nice thing, and we spent time with each other, and we did something called Come Dine With Me. So we did a challenge. Each had to take it in terms of cooking a big meal for everybody to enjoy, and then we rated ourselves on it. So we all spent a lot of time in the kitchen creating stuff. And actually, I think we engaged more in that time than we had for years beforehand in all of our busy lives, going off to school, going off to college, going off to work, and sort of, listening to the views of my kids. I hadn't done for some while. Really, really refreshing. And there's one exercise which I really recommend, was the empathise bit of this. When we were all arguing the Brexit referendum, which was hugely stressful, somebody asked me and the neighbouring MP, who had different views, to address a public meeting, and that I was in favour of Brexit. I had to address the public meeting as if I was in favour of Remain, and the other MP who was in favour of Remain had to address the meeting and take questions if he was in favour of Brexit. We had to completely reverse our roles. It was very entertaining, but really made you think about how you put yourself into the play, into the mind, into the space of somebody else whose views you may challenge. If you understand where they're coming from, then actually your challenge is much more validated, I think, and you have much more worthwhile engagement with people who have different views.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we've got baths, compost, nature, arts, healthy culture, keeping faith in goodness, some of the suggestions from our panelists. I can see a couple of questions coming in, really meaty, great questions from participants. So keep those coming and upvote the ones that you want us to have the time to answer. Talking of timing, I'm going to open up to our main question of the night to each of our panelists, which is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? And I'm going to ask Minna, please, if you could kick us off with your reflection on that question.
Sure. Okay, so I think the way that I saw this question is I'm going to try to put it in a way that is coherent, because what I think in essence is that when you ask, is there time for self-care in a climate crisis? My instant reaction is that the way that we think about time is part of the climate crisis. And so when we basically, the way that we look at the world is as this warehouse from which we can extract and exploit as much resources, as a sort of endless pool of resources. It's like an Amazon warehouse. And the thing that enables that kind of mega complex that we have turned our cosmos into is time. Like time is instrumentalized to kind of continue that process, which is so destructive and exploitative. And so we have industrial time, which is also very much part of a patriarchal time order in which, women are domesticated, workers are domesticated, everything is kind of, time is just basically used to continue this enterprise. And that enterprise is the very cause of the climate emergency and climate collapse and the loss of biodiversity and ecocide. And so in order to respond to that question, I would say that there absolutely has to be time, but for self-care. But the way that that can become a reality is actually by reimagining what time is, because the way we think of it now is that we're kind of all busy, like even in our responses to how we ourselves each make time, we're talking about our busy schedules, and then we have to have an hour for a bath, an hour to relax, an hour to whatever it might be, and so it's almost as though there's the world in which like where all of these big bad decisions are kind of being made, which is what I'm talking about, this industrial time. And then we see ourselves as like stealing little moments in which we can prioritize the self, but that in itself reinforces the kind of machinery. And so if we reimagine time, if we reframe how we think about time, it's certainly a complex thing to do, but I think that's where we kind of have to go. And in so doing, it becomes apparent, and I can speak about that later in order to allow others to respond, but it becomes more and more apparent that actually, self-care is completely essential. It is part of reimagining time. Like, in fact, I would, to end, reimagining time is self-care.
So you're talking about there's this like separateness, and you're talking about, if I understand you correctly, integrating those things together. And the more we say self-care or planet care, the more it's actually exacerbating the problem. Have I understood you right?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We then see ourselves as separate from the planet, and separate from the things that are causing the destruction of the planet. So
and it's increasing. Yes, we both did this at the same time. Tim, I wonder if you want to respond to what Minna has said there.
I put in terms of simple answer to the question is yes, there has to be, and it's essential. I mean, there's research that finds that subjective well-being and mental health are associated with greater concern for the environment and other bigger than self issues. And climate change is a huge worry for a great many people. COVID is a huge worry at the moment, but COVID will be gone soon, we hope, and climate change is going to be there and all its threatening challenges that we have. And I think it comes about largely because of our failure to self-regulate and the need to look after ourselves and get the right work-life balance, for example, is complementary to getting right civilization, natural environment, global balance as well. Healthy mind, healthy body, healthy planet, you could say. And I think campaigners and other leaders who have engaged, we have to think about self-care differently, not as an optional extra, as this question is almost phrased, but as something, as a way to make keeping our actions appropriate and sustainable. And rather than considering self-care as a sort of pampering, as some people might caricature it, we think about it as maintaining and tuning an instrument, like a musical instrument, for example. For instance, a professional guitarist might regularly replace the strings or fingerboard and so on, and not to maintain would be unprofessional. So it's absolutely essential that we do make sure that we provide time for self-care if we are to be in any fit state to do what it takes to change our lifestyles, to acknowledge and then do something about the climate emergency.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah, not to maintain is unprofessional. Okay, Maddy, can I put this question to you as well to jump in?
You can, and I think I'll just be really short. Like I agree with what everybody's contributed so far, and I guess like when you're facing the challenge of the climate crisis, you are your most valuable resource. And so, you know, that old adage that you need to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help others and get involved in something, like that's what self-care is. And I think it should feel like it's part and parcel of the work rather than something that's separate or something that facilitates, because if we're trying to reimagine the world as something better, and in doing that we need to care for ourselves and each other.
Fab. Okay, I want to touch on something, Maddy, that you said earlier, and then we'll perhaps go to the questions for each of you that I had that were pre-submitted. You said something about the climate policy world that you work in being quite macho and technocratic. I think there's resonance there with what Minna was saying, in terms of like this separateness and it being seen, self-care as being seen as something that we kind of fit in rather than something that like changes the whole way that we view the world and is brought to everything that we do. And I'm aware of holding that with Tim's perspective as the only man on the panel and how difficult it can be for men to talk about self-care, I think, in relation to women. So I wondered if there was anything, Maddy, Minna, that you wanted to reflect back on those sort of strands that are developing in our conversation.
I think, I guess two things. So firstly, I appreciate that it is difficult for men to talk about self-care, and it feels really important that there's space, there's a language that's kind of developed for men to do that. But I think it's also, I do want to emphasize that while that is true, it is more difficult for women as a group to practice self-care. Because women are, multitasking and juggling so many things, and typically and statistically still more responsible for the domestic space, but also, juggling with work and childcare and care work, and it's very tricky for women to actually find time for what we refer to as self-care, so time to just, be with yourself. The other thing that I would just say with this strand that's developing is that a lot of, because we obviously are just here for a short period of time, but I feel that what is often missed in the conversation about climate justice is the connection to feminist work. Women have been, the feminist kind of compendium has been doing work to protect Mother Earth for so long, and showing how there are connections in a patriarchal society between the destruction of non-human nature and the oppression of women. So we have a vast resource from which we can find a lot of answers to these questions. But absolutely, to put it briefly, there's a big connection between the kind of what I would call maybe the gendering of the climate emergency, and we should be paying attention to how that affects women and men differently.
Okay, great. Anything you want to add, Maddy?
No, I guess just maybe this to touch on the kind of the technocratic and kind of policy space that the climate debate has been in for many, many decades, and it feels like actually people are really with the level of public concern and public awareness now about climate at record levels, and people are seeing and experiencing climate impacts themselves, seeing climate impacts happening around the world, and are starting to feel emotions about it. And I think the climate sector professionally really needs to be able to switch and kind of grapple with that and engage with it as individuals, because you see people who've been in the climate sector for a long time go through moments like whenever there's a big COP, everybody pours all this energy into a big climate meeting, and it never delivers the results that anyone actually needs or expects. And then you lose so many people all the time because it's seen as it's about experts, it's about data, it's about arguments, and it's not about humans. And at the end of the day, this is all about humans. And I think that's maybe one of those other factors we need to try and bring back into these kind of technical spaces. Okay,
wonderful. Just picking up on a bit going on in the chat and discussion, people appreciating this conversation as it's unfolding. So thank you for that. We've got 6 questions which we're going to come to. Before we do, Tim, I wonder, I've got a question for each of you, maybe 30 seconds, a minute. They're quite meaty questions, so we'll see how we go. My job, my previous organisation was working with politicians, and it really shocked me actually the difference between how politicians are portrayed in the media and then the reality. I know, for example, you're leaving this call at 8:15, not to go and relax, but to go and do another piece of work. And that's what it's like for MPs. Like, it's dawn till dusk and beyond. And there's so much public scrutiny that comes with that. There's the pandemic going on. There's, parliamentary stuff going on with Brexit that's feeling like our political system's kind of under strain in ways that it's never kind of been before. What would you say to someone that says, like, I don't have time to take a bath for an hour in the morning? Like, what work have you done for yourself that goes, I don't care what's going on, this is what I need to do in order to be able to do my job properly? Like, what advice would you give to people that are feeling that sense of, I don't have time? Because if anyone doesn't have time, I would say an MP doesn't have time, but you have found time.
You're right. So it's sort of damned if we do, damned if we don't. And it's not a new phenomenon. For decades and centuries, politicians have been fairly low down the public opinion rankings, and now is no different. But you're right. For them, people actually take the trouble to try and understand what an MP's job is and the sort of hours that we work. Then there's a bit more of an appreciation like that. But of course, that's not the good story in the media. So the media are not really interested in that. So we've got to cope with all those slings and arrows that we get anyway, as well as coping with what's quite a difficult job, with having to be an expert on everything, as I said, from to climate change to education to the pandemic. And then, of course, when the pandemic kicks off, my 350 emails a day became 600 emails a day, with everybody desperately know how they're going to get food for the shops, whether they've got to isolate, how they're going to get their drugs, etc., etc., etc. And the MP become the first port of call. And of course, you're completely useless if you don't give them an instantaneous answer. So that's quite a lot of pressure. And what's been really interesting, I mean, mental illness amongst politicians is probably quite high, but it's been in the past, because it's very difficult, it has been until recently, for MPs to admit that they've got a weakness, which happens to be what people would see as a weakness, as a mental illness. And yet they don't caricature and poke fun at or criticize other people who have a physical illness. You know, if I was diagnosed with a heart condition or diabetes or whatever, people would be, hopefully would be sympathetic. So why shouldn't they be sympathetic about having a mental illness? But until a few years ago, if you had a mental illness as an MP and had to take more than 6 months out to cover, you could be sacked. You could actually be recalled, and there will be a by-election. What other business, what other job could that possibly happen in that way? Only if it were a mental illness. Now that all changed. And actually what has been really interesting over the last few years, the number of MPs, actually nearly all men as well, have spoken out about their own illness in the chamber, in public, in front of cameras with audiences of thousands, have said, yeah, I have problems. I suffer whatever it may be, and it makes my job a bit more difficult. I have developed coping mechanisms, and this is how I handle it. And I think I'm just as good as MP by having those experiences, because 1 in 10 of my constituents is probably having those experiences as well. Figures got higher during the pandemic. And I think that has led to a bit of a reappraisal by the public that actually perhaps MPs aren't all Zilons from the planet Tharg, but they are human beings with a sort of rather extraordinary job under a lot of pressure. And yeah, some are going to be suffering from mental illness, just like my husband or my neighbour or whatever. And I think that has changed a lot. And I think it's been the bravery of certain MPs who sort of came out and said, yeah, I have that challenge, but I'm getting on with it. That's really changed the dynamics of how people see some of the pressures that we are under. People still think MPs are pretty useless and waste of money, but we've tried.
So I hear you talking there from deeply embedded within the system. People say not climate change, system change, and you are working from within the system and the constraints of the system. In what I consider quite a radical approach. In all the years I spent working with MPs, I never really once heard MPs talking about self-care. I wonder, Minna, if I could turn to you and with this question kind of following on from that of do you have a perspective on what is genuine self-care? Because self-care is something that's become really, really popular, really commercialized, something that I think, is traditionally associated more and more with white women doing yoga, and spending a lot of money on doing those things. It's kind of all over Instagram. There's a lot to be made out of self-care from a commercial perspective, which obviously kind of props up stuff like the climate emergency in not a good way. So is there such thing as genuine self-care and not genuine self-care? How would we tell the difference? Do you have any advice for us on that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's the most useful way of putting it. Like, I wouldn't want to create a dichotomy between what is genuine self-care and not, because ultimately people like finding ways to discover themselves and to wind down and relax and have leisure is good, right? But I guess the first thing to say is that I think in some sense, all of life should be self-care. We live in a really challenging world at a challenging period of time, and we only live once, so all of life should in some sense be seen as self-care. And maybe when you think of it that way, then it's easier also to answer whether in just subscribing to a kind of superficial understanding of what self-care might be, what is that contributing to one's own life, and then of course to how is that impacting the climate emergency. I do think that there is certainly a lot of capitalist, consumerist self-care out there, and there's a kind of grave misunderstanding, I think, that underpins that. Because if you are consuming a product or a service which is supposedly been set up in the favor of your self-care, which, let's be honest, at this period in time, pretty much every brand is, sort of has adopted a kind of political movement language. So, even if it's you subscribing to a coffee subscription at Pret, is sort of marketed to you as self-care, and almost as if that in itself were some kind of political act. But the question to ask, I guess, in relationship to what that is doing to our planet, is the product or the service that you are purchasing, is it making somebody a profit? That's the first question. And that's not necessarily going to be a bad thing in itself, but then the question is, who is it making a profit, and how? And if that thing then in itself is sort of not ethical and is perpetuating climate change, then there might be something to question about how you practice self-care. I guess ultimately, like, we want to move, I think we need to maybe preface self-care and say that what we want to practice is a kind of conscientious self-care. And that brings a space in which self-care, even on an individual level, if it is conscientious, looks quite different. Because, you know, you could be in a spa or in a yoga class, and superficially that looks like you're practicing self-care, but internally there may be a lot of turbulence, and you might actually be feeling really stressed out and busy and frustrated. And then on the other flip side, somebody could be actually on the surface behaving in a very busy way, but internally feeling really at peace and at ease. But when we think of self-care more conscientiously, then, you know, it becomes about replicating your value system, even in your own sort of private space. And then, of course, broadening that to how we interact with brands and with consumerism, and just bringing in more kind of insight and conscientiousness to that effect.
I love that. So again, you're calling us to move away from like what's genuine self-care and like integrate, again, moving away from the separateness to integrating, and like, yeah, what's going on the inside and outside. And okay, I love that. Maddy, I guess putting my sort of, you know, was the director of a charity hat on now, and I was responsible for all the fundraising mostly at the time, and it never occurred to me to put in a funding application that included self-care for my staff. That was something that if we were going to pay for it, we had to kind of find it out of core cost. That was really difficult to get hold of anyway. And so, you know, for those of us that are working in our day jobs in this sector, this is relevant. But I think even if you're not, it's this question of like, we can talk about how good self-care is, but putting our money where our mouth is, and is this something really that we can give our money to? So I'm asking you, I guess, with your funders hat on, is this something you think funders are willing to fund? You know, are they going to look at an application that includes, you know, a Headspace membership or a retreat weekend or whatever, and go, no, like we've got an emergency, this is not what funders' money is for? You're also in contact with so many philanthropists who put their money towards this. You know, how are they going to feel as stakeholders? Do you have, perspective for us on that?
Yes, I mean, it's certainly something that I'm hearing funders talk about a lot more, especially in relation to working with social movements and young people. You know, the youth, there was a newly energized youth movement back in 2019 with the school strikes bursting on the scene. And many in the climate movement felt this sort of surge of optimism and this renewed faith that the youth have this, the cavalry's here. But that was really patronizing, actually, and it placed this huge increased burden on these young people's shoulders. And we all sort of sat and watched as the youth movement was riddled with problems in the UK and just driven by so many factors, and one of them being this prevalence of burnout and anxiety. And that movements always go and have life cycles of like bursts of energy and then collapse, and bursts of energy and collapse of energy. But we need to, there's a real knowledge amongst funders now of the need to invest in the sustainability of leaders within our movement. So there's an emergence of spaces now that are being funded, from sort of youth resiliency training sessions, retreats, online courses, intergenerational conversations. So there's sort of building of this infrastructure around the movement to support it and help it be resilient. But then I think aside from funding those projects directly, there's a bunch of things that funders should be doing as a routine. So we like providing flexible multi-year support where possible, which I know is the total dream. But when making like project grants, like understand and support the true cost of the work. So building in budget to cover indirect costs as well as direct costs. You know, we don't do good sustainable work if we're always stretching ourselves too thinly. The second thing is to like build in organizational development and resilience into budgets. So it's one of the questions that I always ask when I'm looking at a budget is like, do you need a mentor? Do you need a coach? Like, is there stuff in here for capacity building? Are you taking enough time out? And just making sure that we're asking those questions all the time and building that into the budgets. And then I think the third thing is basically like being okay with failure and encouraging it. Like, we need to support our community to be brave and try new things. And people won't be brave and try new things if they fear losing their support of their funders if things go wrong. But it's not wrong if you learn from it. So we need to build really honest relationships built on trust and openness in order to be able to have those conversations so that people feel confident in what they're doing.
I got goosebumps at the end when you said about making mistakes and being brave and holding each other in that way. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to move on to, we've got 45 minutes left, just under, so we're going to move on to questions from participants. Thank you for upvoting those. I'm going to start with the top one, why not? So when you already work in the climate sector, sounds like one for Maddy to start with, how do you engage with climate activism beyond your role without it feeling like work / you're never able to switch off? Maddy, can I come back to you again?
Yeah, sure. I saw that question being voted up and I was just sort of mulling over what my answer to it might be. And actually, I guess I'm going to kind of pinch Minna's tip in saying that, like, I have never separated those two things out. So I've been lucky enough that my work has been my activism and my activism has been my work. So it's not been a challenge that I've faced. But I see colleagues working in different parts of the sector who do climate activism on the side. And they pick things that give them energy, right? And they pick things that are in an area that they don't get to work in their day job, or doing things that they don't get to do in their day job. Because I think it can be tempting in activism, if you've got skills in fundraising and you're a fundraiser, to then go and do fundraising for a social movement or for activism on the side. But actually, like, do something else that's different to your day job, and maybe that won't feel quite so much like your day-to-day job.
Yes, I feel like I'm not a panelist, I should probably keep my mouth shut, but it's also redefining surely what we see as activism, because actually, like as Tim said, putting compost on is a form of activism, or talking to your friends about climate change is a form of activism. So it's finding something that's completely different. That's certainly for me is thinking about different types of activism. Anyway, question for Minna. This has been put up to the top. Do take a moment, if you're a participant, to scroll through the questions that we've got, because we've got some really great ones that came through later as well, and to give those a chance of being upvoted. And Minna, when you talk about reimagining time, yes, I thought this too, and how we see ourselves in relation to the earth and the destruction thereof, I hear a need for systemic, holistic change. Could you expand on this and its relation to the urgency our society and environment are feeling right now? I understand this question is like, please give us a how-to, because that sounds awesome and we'd like to do it. And do you have a minute?
Thank you. That is a great question. And I mean, I do, unfortunately, I'm not sure if there is a kind of how-to, but I will attempt it. Because yes, I am speaking of a kind of holistic and systemic approach. And the how-to comes in here. So to give a kind of more practical take on that. At the moment, there's obviously a lot of conversation around things like geoengineering, right? So, involving entrepreneurship and Silicon Valley and all of that. And it's a different sort of panel conversation about whether or not that's the strategic approach to adopt. But in my view, I do think that those kinds of solutions always seem quite short term to me. And so in order to not just solve a problem for like 20 years to come, but actually create a planet that can survive for many future generations, we do need like a holistic systems approach to it. And so I guess the how-to is really grasping that we have to change our relationship to time, and that is just as important as saying we have to change our relationship to the climate. We cannot do one or the other without the other, right? And so it has to do with, it's almost like having that light bulb moment where you just have an epiphany that, okay, that's where I need to go with this. And so to give another more practical, concrete example, we very frequently, we've all been talking so much about busyness, and I see that also in the questions, like people feel overwhelmed and inundated, and we live in a culture that is constantly promoting productivity and optimization and whatnot. And there is a lot of conversation about like switching off our productivity hats and quite often in connection with work and in connection with social media. But there isn't a lot of conversation about that, or not enough in connection with climate emergencies. And so I think just, again, once you reframe the question of time here, you kind of automatically start to pick up on little gaps and pockets where there's room for change, where there's room for expansion. And there was one more thing that I wanted to say, but it's just escaped my mind now. But maybe I can come back to that if it comes to me. But it really is a kind of perception shift. Maybe I can share one last. I mean, I work in the world of ideas, so forgive me for not having like the how-tos, but more so the images and the symbols, which I think are part of the compendium of how-tos that we need now, is that we need new images and new symbols, and we can learn from history. So, in the word time, and, chronos being something that represents time, and the chronic being something that is quite negative. Like when something is chronic, it's quite toxic. But there's another ancient Greek philosophical word that was complementary to chronos, which is kairos. And kairos, but where chronos is quantitative, and that's kind of industrial time and how we separate and exploit, kairos is qualitative time. So kairos is basically when the right thing happens at the right point. And so this kind of holistic approach and a kind of methodology that can change how we operate in the world. And somebody mentioned relationships earlier, even our relationships are so contingent on how we perceive time. And if we bring in a little bit of that element of kairos, maybe to give a how-to, wake up tomorrow morning, or, when you set your alarm, or maybe don't set your alarm, whatever it might be, try to bring in some element of kairos, maybe tomorrow, see if you can not go by industrial time, and if you can go by when something like intuitively, holistically feels right, whether it's making a phone call to a friend or not purchasing a particular, product or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. I just did a week in nature, like a nature facilitation training. And the first thing that they did when we got there was they took our phones off us, and then they made us scramble our watches. So we had no idea what the time was for a week. And I was like, oh my gosh, no. But actually it was so great. And if you have the opportunity to do that, I would really, really recommend it. Second what Minna said. Tim, there's a question here that I think would be great for you to have a look at. Is there time for self-care when you have survivor's guilt? These past few days, I simply have not been able to get the heat dome deaths in the Pacific Northwest out of my mind, and I'm constantly haunted by the places and people that are not in the news cycle who are suffering worsening impacts of the climate crisis. I believe we all need self-care, but in my heart of hearts, it feels like an indulgence. And I'm thinking there, Tim, of you said about all these emails coming in, and it's trauma. It's trauma coming into your inbox, 600 emails about whatever. How do you deal with that survivor's guilt, which is very much a trauma response?
So I think the analogy, I think it was Maddy who said about putting your own oxygen mask on first. So if you are to contribute, if you are to do something about the terrible symptoms of climate change that we are seeing, then you need to make sure you are in a condition, a state to be able to assimilate and then contribute to doing something about it. And we're not going to contribute to climate change by all of us going over to what's happening in Canada or the US and sort of, manning the fire hoses or whatever. We've all got to be doing our bit way upstream to that, and encouraging everybody else to do their bit as well, and to put pressure on government to collectively do their bit on behalf of us all. And we've all got to make changes in our in our lifestyle, in our work patterns, in our domestic patterns, and everything else. So actually not being in a position to be able to do something about it is making the situation worse. And I just think there's the productivity point as well that Minna made just now, and the huge pressure of everybody to be more productive, but also just to go back to the previous question about self-care being almost caricatured in some of the products that we get, because you're worth it, or indulge yourself, as the advertising and branding slogans go. All of those are linked to having more stuff, whether it be an expensive shampoo, or to all sorts of consumerist things, including your phone that we never knew that we desperately needed and now can't do without. Actually regulating ourselves to be more productive by doing things more efficiently and doing things in a better state of mind. So to take the example of mindfulness, London Transport was one of the first organisations to introduce mindfulness for all its employees. And London Transport had a problem with absenteeism and people being in sick. So they brought in mindfulness available to all employers across the board. And within a short space of time, their absenteeism rate fell by 73%. And people felt better about themselves. The employer gave time to take out to indulge themselves, in this case, in mindfulness, to get their mind around things and related, and they worked more happily and therefore more productively. So actually, if you look after yourself, you are far more effective in doing your job and looking after everybody else as well. So self-care is not indulgence. It's actually making you in a much better state to contribute to whatever it may you want to contribute to. In this case, how we do it to help combat climate change.
What I hear you talking about at the beginning is like practicing boundaries, and it's so much easier said than done. We can't help people over in Canada that are going through this, that, and the other. But we feel we might know in our minds that we can't, but we feel it. Of course we do, because we're all connected. But then when you come in with your mindfulness point like that, that's a how-to on how we actually sink in, connect these two parts of ourselves to actually be able to find our way through the complexity of the individual and our need to survive and thrive as individuals, and our sense of this kind of collective collapse that's going on. I wonder if any of our panelists can jump in at this point. There's a question that's been upvoted at the top around privilege, which I think really resonates with what you're saying, Tim, about kind of it's not really a privilege to practice self-care, it's essential. So I wonder, Maddy or Minna, if you would like to jump in. I'll read out the question. I wonder if all this talking about self-care is not just another sign of the enormous privilege we enjoy compared to those who suffer from the effects of climate change and must expand all their efforts simply to survive as a family. On the other side, how much of our own activism for climate, etc., is based on some kind of a feeling of guilt for this privilege and our own part in creating and profiting from the problem in the first place?
This is an excellent question. I think it really speaks to what I was saying about self-care at the moment being spoken of as something really separate, and how that is, it's seen as something that is separate, and therefore it is something that we buy, we purchase, we indulge in. And so therefore you could answer this question by saying, yes, of course, it has to do with privilege, because so long as we're thinking of self-care in those ways, then that means that it is, a very small percentage of the world's population who actually can afford it, if, either financially or because they live in a part of the world where the climate emergency is not yet impacting them as severely as in other parts. But when you think of it, or when you realize, because it's not really an opinion somehow, it's like self-care is what life should be about. And maybe I should add that it's the kind of self with a big S, so not just the individual self, but the collective self. And then it is, it is still, of course, a privilege. Not everybody, very few people actually, a very small percentage can really dwell on that and think about what that might look like. But I don't think that we should sort of cripple ourselves from that. In fact, that should expand our need and our understanding of self-care, precisely because it is something as a kind of driving motor of what we have to make life about if we're going to really love the planet. Because so much of the taking action and being the kind of change that you want to see in the world does not really come from or it could come from a kind of activism. And I loved what you said, Joe, about, a big question here is like, what is activism today? What does that actually look like? But in some sense, it's more important that a person really loves the planet and encourages others to really love the planet than for them to become activists for the planet. And self-care, again, it becomes evident when you think of loving the planet, that self-care is part of that. You are part of the planet, you are part of nature, you're not separate from it. And so then it's not really you reuniting yourself with the cosmos and the non-human natural world is not you acting privileged, but that means that you have to be practicing that in a conscientious way that also cares about others, right? If you're only practicing it in a way that is about consumerism, then it is a practice of privilege rather than a real genuine love for our biodiversity.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me hugely, and my relentless activism actually was in itself created more of a separateness between myself and nature, because I expected myself to not adhere to the rhythms of night and day and summer and winter, but just to go relentlessly. And then it was only through like burning out and not being able to do anything for a long time that I realized that actually, we have to adhere to the rhythms of nature in order to heal nature. We have to be part of nature, and our activism can't be built on that same model. But it's hard. It's a hard thing to convey because there is so much guilt or survivor's guilt that's coming up, and this thing of guilt that's coming up. It's so challenging to actually say it's okay that I'm human and therefore need to rest. I'm an animal too. Maddy or Tim, do you want to jump in with anything on this thing of privilege and self-care?
I guess just to say that, like, for me, self-care is about keeping up energy and being able to keep engaged and active in what you want to be engaged and active on. And if a sense of guilt helps you to do that, then that's not, I don't know how much of a problem that is, because that can be a really motivating factor, right? You're motivated by the suffering of other humans that you're seeing, and then that's motivating you to go out and do stuff. I think kind of then putting the idea of privilege on top of this, and I think someone's just asked in the chat the reflection of like wondering how a person in a disadvantaged part of the world would be considering these questions. And I think that's really interesting. I also think there's an acknowledgement that we are in a privileged part of the world, and it can be really disabling if you just sort of say, well, this is just coming from my place of privilege, therefore I shouldn't do it. I don't know, I find you end up in a kind of a spiral when you think in that way.
Yes, I guess definitely. It's inevitable. We are in a privileged position. Just interesting, the question I had just now about the fires in the States at the moment and the terrible things going on there. Well, that's because that's what the media choose to focus on, whereas mass destruction, environmental destruction, is going on in part of the continent of Africa or South America, wherever it be, on a daily basis. People's lifestyles are really challenged because of climate change, but it's not reportable. It does not hit the headlines because we are conditioned by what comes out of the northwest states or the east coast of the states or European democracies or whatever. That what conditions us. But I mean, if we really need to do something, then we need to be absolutely putting ourselves in the position of somebody who hasn't got time to think about changing their lifestyles because they've somehow got to find food or water, clean water, or look after their family on a day-to-day existence. And I think we have to use our privilege to put ourselves into their mindset and their conditions as to how on earth we could begin to change their circumstances such that they could start to think about what would be more environmentally friendly in my lifestyle. You know, why is it in Ghana, for example, they are burning loads of plastic? I've set up a project between my schools in Sussex and schools in Ghana where we've exchanged computers, and they used to burn plastic for fuel because they didn't have anything else. Now we're importing baskets and crafts made from plastic, which they now export to the UK, and we help them sell to provide money for them to buy prop fuel for their energy sources and try and grow sustainably or whatever. But no, we're all focused on the wildfires going on in the States at the moment.
Yeah, there's sharing those positive stories and this idea that actually we're capable of change and we're capable of positive things in the world. If all we ever hear is that we're, human beings are awful for the world, that's what we're going to believe about ourselves. And how would we change the story? Minna, were you wanting to say something on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, because there is a risk that we kind of overemphasize that we can't do that much. And I do think that what we can do is, again, is to become more conscientious, more informed. And once we do that, I think, it's really important to hold those guilty feelings that we have and that we rightly have, because there are people in the world that don't have the privileges that we do in this part of the world. But to use, as Maddy was saying, I think it can be really productive to channel that guilt. But what is important is to channel it in the right direction. And of course, many people do. But one thing to sort of bear in mind is like, I think, Europe consists of about 11% of the global population, but is responsible for about 60% of climate change. And so we need to really, in addition to, of course, working with communities in places like Ghana and elsewhere, but we also really need to challenge back here at home, and the kind of the systems. Again, it's about a kind of systems change, because we're just not going to be able to resolve this otherwise when we're not addressing the really big culprits.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to flag that there's a lot of love for you, our panelists, coming through on the chat, so do have a look at that to see that coming through, and loads of really good suggestions for resources, so please do keep sharing those with each other, including, saw someone shared Capacitar. I did a Capacitar workshop 3 years ago, and I loved it so much. It's these sort of mindful movements that can just clear what's going on in the body so easily. And I couldn't remember the name of it, so I'm so grateful for you sharing that with me. I'm aware, Tim, that you have to hop off in 5 minutes. So I wanted to start with a pre-submitted question for you, which is, are you aware of any other self-care practices that other MPs are doing beyond mindfulness?
I'm sure there's a lot. It's just that mindfulness has become the thing. So as I say, we started an all-party group, and we started having weekly sessions with the instructors from the Oxford Mindfulness. So we're very lucky to have the experts who came to us. And as I say, about 250 or more MPs and members of the Lords have gone through a course and regularly go back for top-up and refresher courses. But it's not just about looking after ourselves. We then use that practice to see how mindfulness can be applied to policy. Mindfulness schools, is a really big thing. A lot of teachers wanting to sort of get to know about mindfulness and how it applies to their pupils, and it has to be applied in a whole school approach. And the great thing about mindfulness is it's non-stigmatizing. It's not something that the naughty boys or girls do. It's something that everybody does and enjoys. It's really inclusive as a result of that, and it's shown, and now research has shown, that behaviour is better across the school. The results are actually better across the school as well, and people filter about themselves, and it's a real level in that respect as well. How it applies in the health service, how it applies in businesses, how it applies actually in the justice system, in prisons. There are certain prisons are using mindfulness with extraordinary results as well. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, because mindfulness is so good, so all-encompassing. Why would we need something else as well? Because you can apply it to everything. And as I say, the great thing about mindfulness, it's like jogging for the mind. Just as back in the 70s, somebody invented jogging, it was seen a bit quirky. Actually, it's become mainstream now, because we can now start producing the evidence of the outcomes that it's having. Then people are accepting it. We're no longer a bunch of key MPs who do it. Actually, we're showing the results, and that's great. And hey, it's nothing new. You know, Buddhist tradition has made it in different forms for going back many centuries. We sort of reinvented it and applied it to our modern day needs, and probably it's much more needed now than it ever has, whether it's been thinking about and dealing with climate change or all the other parts of our sort of stressful, busy lives.
I love your passion for mindfulness. And you're touching now on social mindfulness, which, you know, in its original form, mindfulness was something that was done in the whole community, and it wasn't just kind of something that we had to practice on our own. And building those mindful spaces is really important. What I'm going to ask you, squeeze one more question in, Tim, which is, do you worry, this is another pre-submitted question, do you worry about the other MPs burning out and the impact that this has on their decision making? Could this be related to some of the scandals that we see in the media?
Wow, well, there's a whole seminar in itself, isn't there? Absolutely. I mean, look, I worked in the city before I came to politics, and that's quite a high pressure job, but it was nothing compared to the pressures that you have now. You know, you're expected to be 365 days a year served. I get one of my heaviest email bags is on Boxing Day. So constituents who've got fed up with all the in-laws by Boxing Day think, right, I'm going to write to my MP about all the ills of the world. And if they haven't had a response by the after Boxing Day, you're doing a rubbish job. You know, how does anybody cope with that? And for many people, it can lead to burnout. And in the past, you know, a lot of MPs have committed suicide, have had some mental illness, and you daren't admit it. It was all sort of covered up. And an MP under those sorts of stresses, facing those sorts of challenges, is not going to do his or her job very well, and is not going to be in a good place to look after the 90,000 constituents that we all have. So to admit that you're under pressure, to admit that we are just mere mortals and human beings like anybody else trying to do a decent job, what do you think about our politics, is a great bit of progress, and that's what's happened in the last few years. And the fact that we are now seeking solutions, mindfulness is one, absolutely, I think is really to be welcomed. And the way we engage with each other, there are people in Parliament who, before they did mindfulness, were quite shouty, were quite known for sort of, you know, heckling and not really contributing to debate. They have notably, they now think about where they are and what they're doing. And actually, MPs who've done the mindfulness course engage with each other far more respectfully. And if we can do it with each other, then I think that sets us up as better people and better place to engage with our constituents respectfully, even though we may have completely different views. But for goodness sake, we're all trying to get on with doing our job. Let's do it with some respect and kindness towards people, and perhaps the world will be a better place because of it. And then perhaps people might take more of interest and want to do more about climate change as a byproduct of all that as well. So whether all the skills at the moment to do with burnout and not enough people doing mindfulness, we're trying to recruit as many of the other 300 odd MPs to do it as possible, and that may be the solution.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I mean, you touched on a couple of really heavy things, MPs, committing suicide. And I think it's important at that point to say, when you talk about self-care, and mindfulness, it's not the only answer. If somebody is really, really struggling in themselves, professional help is there, must be used as a result. And I would, hate for somebody to come off this call and think, if I can't, fix the troubles that I'm having, my fears about anxiety or whatever, by practicing some mindfulness, then there's something wrong with me. Like, these are hugely complex questions that do also need that professional input as well, which is something you're touching on there.
Absolutely.
And now, when most of us in 15 minutes will be going off probably to get a cup of tea and have a lie down, you're off to do another work thing. So I hope you get a minute to take a breath in between. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're going to carry on with the discussion, but it's been a real pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I have to leave. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so carrying on with the discussion, we've got one here at the top. Maddy, can I direct this one to you at least at the beginning? Because you are like doing this like bird's eye view work all the time. You've got all these different funding applications coming in from like all over the world, and you're having to decide, that's what gets funded and this isn't what gets funded. So you sort of like have this incredible responsibility. And someone said here, how do you stay informed without becoming overwhelmed? I sometimes find a low level of anxiety is motivating, but if it becomes too much, it makes me feel like I have to ignore everything to protect myself, which isn't helping anyone. Do you have any advice for us on information overload and how that affects us?
It's such a good question, and it is overwhelming. Like, I think it's one of the things that I find the hardest is not just the kind of day-to-day of the work I do, but of like staying informed about what's happening out there, about the science, about the solutions, and about the politics that are surrounding all of this. And it's really difficult to not make it feel overwhelming. Like, hands up, I probably cry twice a day. And it's just a sense of like, actually for me, that's a bit of a release. And then I'll always like know when it's getting too much and manage to walk away and do something else. And I think we just have to kind of admit that it is overwhelming, and try and be really, I think one of the things that I find so like crucial is always like feeling, I think it's probably different for everybody, right? But I like to make myself feel quite small, of like, it's not all on my shoulders, and what I do is not the thing that's going to unlock the solution or win anything or like really solve everything else. And actually, once you take that burden off yourself, it becomes much lighter. And then you don't feel the need to act on every piece of information you're getting. So that's just one little kind of trick I try, and also to just try and absorb information that isn't about this stuff. And information that gives you hope and makes you feel more positive.
Fab, thank you. I'm wondering, Minna, do you have anything? People talk about information overload, and you talked about how you sort of operate in the world of the arts and symbols and images. Does that have anything to say to us about those of us who might be feeling information overwhelmed? Are there different types of information?
Yeah. Big time. A big time, yes. I always encourage people to read more, and to just pick up a novel or a nonfiction, whatever you enjoy, and to not sort of just be consuming so much social media, Instagram, Twitter, and even like a lot of sort of online writing, whether it's essays or opinion pieces or research, academic research, or just like statistics. There's something very different, I guess, speaking of Kairos, I was comparing Kairos and Chronos earlier. I think when we read, or for some people, it might be when you just look at art, you go to a gallery or an exhibition, or you go out for a walk. It's kind of about stimulating a different part of your senses and your psyche. And I think, I saw in the comments regarding mindfulness, like not being the all-encompassing solution, which, I appreciate that you, Joe, also made a point to note. But I think someone said about how, it needs to be complemented with kind of more, this person mentioned a psychological approach, but I think also, you know, with that kind of slowing down and that kairos and that reading or gaining information and knowledge from other sources than that like hyper speeded up information technology that we resort to. I was thinking earlier about, you know, I had this image of somebody having a long bath, which, you know, we could argue a bath is part of like, is contributing to climate change and, you know, how we overuse water. But anyway, like that kind of practice of self-care, but, you know, maybe scrolling through your Instagram feed or something, like it's so counterintuitive. And we all do that. It's not about like making people feel guilty, but I think we do need to intentionally bring space-time into our lives when we can absorb a different quality of information. And that in itself can bring, you know, ultimately what this kind of approach does is it really helps us to augment our capacity for empathy. And that again is connected to like loving nature, but also loving others and empathizing with people, right? And that's people in other parts of the world that are not as privileged, but also people in this, you know, in this country, in our environment. I watched a documentary the other day about, you know, this young child who lived in, I believe it was in Streatham, and she's like the first child to die due to pollution in London. It's happening right here, and it may seem sort of far-fetched, but really developing our ability for empathy in whichever way that looks like for you is part of changing this structure, right? So that we can care and show up, because that's another thing that's like, you know, the way that we show up, there's so many different ways to show up. I've been seeing a lot of questions about like, you know, I feel guilty if I don't do this and do that. And as Maddy also alluded to earlier, I think, you know, showing up is not just being at the protest or doing the activism. It is also in expressing empathy for others.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, that feels like a really good place to begin drawing the conversation to a close. I wrote down my favourite quotes from each of our panellists. I'm going to share those as sort of a way of recapping the many places that we've gone to this evening. We had from Tim, we are facing the various crises that we're facing as a result of a lack of self-regulation. And then Maddy, your point about movements always moving in waves and having bursts of energy and collapse of energy and bursts of energy. And I found that really helpful in terms of not being alarmed when, you know, this kind of dip happens either in ourselves or collectively. And then Minna, all of life should be seen as self-care, which I think has to be the quote of the evening. I am aware that there are so many questions that we haven't had a chance to answer, and I think this is a good place from which for me to say that I'm going to be running this exact same event again in October. Is there time for self-care in a climate emergency? But with 3 different panellists who cover 3 very different perspectives again. So I have one panellist confirmed for that already, which is Mike Barry, who was the head of sustainability at Marks and Spencer's until very recently. He was there for a couple of decades, did amazing work on M&S's sustainability, but also has a really interesting perspective on his own personal experiences of burnout. So if you're interested in keeping on going with this conversation, then the way to stay in touch with this work is to subscribe to my mailing, and there'll be the link on how to do that coming up in the chat just now. I also send out, when you subscribe, you'll get a little pack, a little sheet that's got some ideas for practicing self-care in a climate emergency. And also I send out weekly ideas, resources, suggestions about how to practice self-care in a climate emergency. So if you're interested in staying in touch with this kind of work, then do subscribe there. I wanted to also, I saw one of the questions that came up, which is around wanting to ask Tim how to engage with politicians on climate change. which we didn't get the chance to look at. But if you're UK based, I'm going to give a shout out to the organisation where I was working until I came to this work, which is Hope for the Future, who do offer amazing support for anyone that wants to engage their MP on climate change. And they also let me use their Zoom for this webinar as well, which I'm very grateful for, considering I don't work for them anymore. And the final thing I'm going to share is just a bit of advice that I had from a lady called Judith Anderson. The Climate Psychology Alliance has been mentioned a lot in the chat, and she's the chair of the Climate Psychology Alliance. I was talking to her this week about this event, and she said to me, and I wanted to pass this on to you, that, you know, okay, so our house is on fire, and we know that, but when a house is on fire and the fire brigade turn up, and it's going to take several days to put that house out, those firefighters take shifts, and it's right that they take shifts, because there's that recognition that you can't work night and day. And if it's a really big fire, then other services come and offer their support, and members of the public get involved and offer food and shelter and those sorts of things. And that's the kind of response actually that you know, when we talk about our house being on fire, it can have this sense of like, never put the hose down, but actually in community we can take shifts, and some shifts will be longer than others. Like some of us will do a really long shift like I did and then take a really long break. For some, a shift is just putting compost in their garden because they've got other things going on. We're all taking our different shifts at different times, and when, you know, we're sort of entering this high summer time, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, and seeing these like extraordinary heat waves, and the impact that has on us emotionally, as we see these impacts that we've been reading about and we're now living, it can be really difficult. And I think another thing Judith and I were talking about was just like, what's the next right thing? Because sometimes that's all you can say to yourself. And so if I was to share one little nugget that has really helped me, it's just asking myself, what's the next right thing? Sometimes it's taking action, and sometimes it's taking a break. Yeah, Joanna Macy being recommended there as well. Really great work. So yes, I want to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists. I thanked Tim already, so thank you, Minna and Maddy. I have so enjoyed hearing from you, and you have not at all disappointed in the huge expectations that I had for the perspectives that you bring. Thank you for being so vulnerable and willing to share from your own experiences as well. Just again, a reminder for anybody that wants to stay in touch with this work, do subscribe to my mailing. And I wish you all a wonderful evening of self-care, because this has been some heavy stuff that we've been discussing. So go get yourselves a cup of tea or whatever feels good for you. Take a deep breath, maybe do some of the mindfulness that Tim talked about, and have a think about what the next right thing is. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.